On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, a German officer standing in a concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach watched the largest amphibious invasion fleet in human history appear out of the morning mist and made a specific, confident tactical judgment based on years of careful German planning. The tide was wrong. The Allies, he calculated, had landed at the worst possible moment of the tidal cycle, exposing their men to a long, deadly crossing of open beach directly into German gun positions. By every rule of amphibious warfare his own training had taught him, this landing should have been a catastrophic failure within the first hour. He was not wrong about the tide. He was wrong about almost everything else. Before we go any further, a quick reminder. While a lot of channels rely on unverified, fake, or exaggerated rumors, we don't play that game. We value your trust. Everything on this channel is strictly verified. Today's episode is sourced from the official U.S. Army Center of Military History's Omaha Beach Campaign Study, Cornelius Ryan's documented research for the longest day, and post-war interrogation records of German coastal defense commanders held in Allied archives. Full source list is in the description below. For years, German military engineers had studied the physics of amphibious invasion with genuine obsessive thoroughness. Tidal charts, beach gradients, the specific killing zones a defended beach could create for an attacking force crossing open sand under fire. On paper, the German defensive plan for Normandy's beaches was a masterpiece of applied military science, and it very nearly worked exactly as designed on at least one specific stretch of that coastline for several genuinely terrifying hours. Think about what that specific combination actually means. This was not a story of German incompetence or of some obvious tactical blunder that a more careful defensive plan could easily have avoided. The specific defensive theory this documentary is about to walk through in detail was genuinely sound by the conventional military logic of its own time, and it was executed with real skill and real resources by soldiers and engineers who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. And for several hours on one specific morning, on one specific beach, it appeared to be working exactly as intended. What German planners consistently failed to properly account for was never really about tides or concrete or the placement of a machine gun. It was about something considerably harder to model on a planning chart: the specific, stubborn, adaptive behavior of individual soldiers and small unit leaders operating without orders, making decisions in real time, on a beach that German doctrine had assumed no one could survive on long enough to make any decisions at all. This is the story of what German coastal defense got right, what it got catastrophically wrong, and why the single best defended beach in the entire invasion very nearly held, and still, in the end, did not. To understand why the German defense of Normandy's beaches failed, despite genuinely sophisticated planning and genuinely formidable fortification, you first need to understand the actual tactical theory underpinning the Atlantic Wall, rather than the popular, simplified image of it as simply a very long, very solid concrete barrier stretching along the French coastline. The Atlantic Wall was never conceived, even by its own German planners, as an impenetrable barrier in the literal sense the name suggests. German military engineers, led in Normandy specifically by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel following his appointment to inspect and improve coastal defenses in late 1943, understood perfectly well that no fixed fortification line, however extensive, could realistically prevent an Allied landing force from getting ashore somewhere along such an enormous stretch of coastline. Rommel's actual defensive doctrine, developed specifically in response to this understood limitation, focused instead on a considerably more precise tactical objective: defeating any Allied landing force within the first minutes and hours of contact with the beach itself, before that force could establish a secure foothold capable of being reinforced and expanded. This doctrine, which historians have come to refer to as Rommel's beach defense strategy, reflected his own direct combat experience commanding armored forces in North Africa, where he had observed firsthand how difficult it became to dislodge an enemy force once it had genuinely established itself in a defended position with time to reinforce and consolidate. Applied to the specific problem of coastal defense, this reasoning led Rommel to a conclusion that placed him in direct documented tactical disagreement with several other senior German commanders, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who favored a more traditional defense-in-depth approach, holding armored reserves well back from the coast and counterattacking any successful landing only after its actual location and strength had been clearly established. Rommel's alternative doctrine held that the beach itself needed to become the primary killing zone, that an Allied invasion force needed to be destroyed while still crossing open sand, still disembarking from landing craft, still in the specific brief window of maximum vulnerability before infantry could establish cover, before tanks could get ashore in meaningful numbers, and before naval gunfire support could be precisely coordinated against identified German positions. This specific doctrinal debate between Rommel and Rundstedt, which was never fully resolved before the actual invasion and resulted in a genuinely uncomfortable operational compromise, sits at the very heart of this documentary's central question. German coastal defense in Normandy was not the product of a single, coherent, universally agreed strategic vision. It was the product of an unresolved internal disagreement between two senior commanders with fundamentally different theories about where and how an Allied invasion should actually be defeated, a disagreement whose consequences would become brutally apparent within the first hours of the actual invasion itself. The specific compromise that emerged from this unresolved disagreement deserves particular attention because it illustrates exactly how institutional indecision at the highest levels of German command translated directly into concrete tactical vulnerability on the ground. Hitler himself, whose personal approval was required for any major reallocation of Germany's limited armored reserves, ultimately imposed a compromise that satisfied neither Rommel's nor Rundstedt's actual tactical theory in full. A portion of the available armored reserve was positioned closer to the coast, in a partial concession to Rommel's beach defense logic, while a further portion remained held back under direct Hitler's own personal authorization requirement, reflecting Rundstedt's preference for a more centrally controlled, deliberately committed counterattack once the actual location and scale of any landing had been clearly established. This specific compromise meant that on the actual morning of the invasion, neither theory could be executed with full confidence or full available resources. Rommel's beach positions lacked the full concentration of firepower his own doctrine called for, while the centrally held reserve Rundstedt favored could not be committed quickly enough, given the bureaucratic requirement for Hitler's personal authorization to meaningfully intervene during the specific early hours when a rapid counterattack might genuinely have mattered most.
Let's walk through, in specific technical detail, exactly what Rommel's beach defense doctrine actually produced on the ground in Normandy, because the sheer engineering sophistication of the resulting defenses deserves genuine, careful examination before this documentary turns to explaining why they nonetheless ultimately failed. Rommel's engineers approached the problem of beach defense with the same kind of applied tactical science that had characterized German military planning throughout the war. Working from detailed tidal charts and beach gradient surveys, German engineers calculated the specific range of tide levels at which an Allied invasion force would most plausibly attempt a landing, and then systematically populated exactly that tidal zone with layered rows of obstacles specifically engineered to destroy landing craft, disable amphibious vehicles, and channel disembarking infantry into pre-registered killing zones covered by machine gun and artillery fire. These obstacles, deployed in successive belts running from the low tide mark up toward the high tide line, included several distinct types, each engineered to defeat a specific anticipated threat. Steel hedgehog obstacles, welded steel beams arranged in angular clusters, were positioned to tear open the hulls of landing craft attempting to approach the beach at mid-tide. Wooden stakes, angled toward the sea and frequently fitted with mines or artillery shells rigged to detonate on contact, targeted landing craft approaching at higher tide levels. Concrete and steel obstacles, known as Belgian gates, heavy enough to seriously damage or destroy a landing craft on direct impact, added a further layer of obstruction across the tidal zone. And behind these physical obstacles, extensive minefields, some of the obstacles themselves rigged with explosive charges specifically intended to detonate when landing craft or advancing troops made contact. This specific tactical advantage of the enfilade arrangement deserves a moment of further explanation, because it represents a genuinely elegant piece of defensive engineering logic in its own right. A machine gun position firing directly out to sea can only effectively engage targets within a relatively narrow arc directly in front of it, and troops advancing along the beach parallel to the shoreline rather than directly toward that specific position's field of fire could in principle find at least some partial cover by moving at an angle to that specific position's most effective field of fire. A machine gun position firing along the length of the beach instead, however, threatens the entire visible stretch of open sand within its range, regardless of which specific direction along that beach an individual soldier happens to be moving, meaning that there was in practice no safe direction of movement across open beach once within range of one of these positions. Only a difference in how quickly a given soldier's specific position along the beach might be reached by that position's sweeping field of fire. Fortified positions themselves, constructed from reinforced concrete, specifically engineered to withstand naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, housed machine guns, anti-tank guns, and in several key positions, larger artillery pieces, capable of engaging landing craft while still well offshore. These positions were, in a specific engineering detail worth noting, generally built with several feet of reinforced concrete on their seaward-facing side, but considerably thinner protection on their landward side. Let's walk through, in specific technical detail, exactly what Rommel's beach defense doctrine actually produced on the ground in Normandy, because the sheer engineering sophistication of the resulting defenses deserves genuine, careful examination before this documentary turns to explaining why they nonetheless ultimately failed. Rommel's engineers approached the problem of beach defense with the same kind of applied tactical science that had characterized German military planning throughout the war. Working from detailed tidal charts and beach gradient surveys, German engineers calculated the specific range of tide levels at which an Allied invasion force would most plausibly attempt a landing, and then systematically populated exactly that tidal zone with layered rows of obstacles specifically engineered to destroy landing craft, disable amphibious vehicles, and channel disembarking infantry into pre-registered killing zones covered by machine gun and artillery fire. These obstacles, deployed in successive belts running from the low tide mark up toward the high tide line, included several distinct types, each engineered to defeat a specific anticipated threat. Steel hedgehog obstacles, welded steel beams arranged in angular clusters, were positioned to tear open the hulls of landing craft attempting to approach the beach at mid-tide. Wooden stakes, angled toward the sea and frequently fitted with mines or artillery shells rigged to detonate on contact, targeted landing craft approaching at higher tide levels. Concrete and steel obstacles, known as Belgian gates, heavy enough to seriously damage or destroy a landing craft on direct impact, added a further layer of obstruction across the tidal zone. And behind these physical obstacles, extensive minefields, some of the obstacles themselves rigged with explosive charges specifically intended to detonate when landing craft or advancing troops made contact. This specific tactical advantage of the enfilade arrangement deserves a moment of further explanation, because it represents a genuinely elegant piece of defensive engineering logic in its own right. A machine gun position firing directly out to sea can only effectively engage targets within a relatively narrow arc directly in front of it. And troops advancing along the beach parallel to the shoreline rather than directly toward that specific position's field of fire could, in principle, find at least some partial cover by moving at an angle to that specific position's most effective field of fire. A machine gun position firing along the length of the beach instead, however, threatens the entire visible stretch of open sand within its range, regardless of which specific direction along that beach an individual soldier happens to be moving, meaning that there was in practice no safe direction of movement across open beach once within range of one of these positions. Only a difference in how quickly a given soldier's specific position along the beach might be reached by that position's sweeping field of fire. Fortified positions themselves, constructed from reinforced concrete, specifically engineered to withstand naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, housed machine guns, anti-tank guns, and in several key positions, larger artillery pieces capable of engaging landing craft while still well offshore. These positions were, in a specific engineering detail worth noting, generally built with several feet of reinforced concrete on their seaward-facing side, but considerably thinner protection on their landward side. A design choice reflecting the doctrine's core assumption that any serious threat to these positions would come from the sea, from naval bombardment and an approaching invasion fleet, rather than from infantry approaching from inland after having already fought their way past the position itself. The specific labor and resources invested in constructing this defensive system deserve some attention as well, because they illustrate just how seriously German military planning treated the overall Atlantic Wall project by the time of the actual invasion. The organization TOT, the same German military engineering and construction agency this channel has covered in detail in its earlier examination of the Channel Islands occupation and its forced labor fortification program, deployed a substantial workforce, drawing heavily on forced and conscripted labor from across occupied Europe, to construct the specific concrete positions and obstacle systems along the Normandy coastline. This construction effort, conducted under considerable time pressure as German planners increasingly anticipated an eventual Allied invasion somewhere along the French coast, represented one of the largest fortification construction projects in modern military history up to that point, consuming a substantial proportion of Germany's available concrete and steel production capacity, at a moment when these same materials were in equally urgent demand across multiple other fronts of the wider war.
This specific design detail, concrete positions heavily armored against the sea but comparatively vulnerable from inland, introduces this documentary's first genuinely significant example of exactly what German planning failed to properly anticipate, and it's worth sitting with in some detail because it illustrates a pattern that repeats throughout this entire story. German defensive doctrine assumed, reasonably enough given available historical precedent up to that point in the war, that an amphibious force would primary and most dangerous threat to fixed coastal positions would come from the sea itself. Naval gunfire, precisely coordinated with an advancing invasion fleet, systematically targeting and destroying German positions before infantry ever needed to directly assault them.
This assumption shaped not only the specific armor orientation of individual bunkers, but the broader tactical logic of the entire beach defense doctrine. Destroy the enemy while still on the water or still crossing open beach, because once infantry actually closed with and got behind a fortified position, that position's defensive value would already have been largely defeated regardless of its remaining structural integrity. What German planners had not fully anticipated, or had at least significantly underestimated in their tactical calculations, was the specific combination of factors that would allow at least some Allied infantry, even on the most heavily defended beaches, to survive the initial crossing in sufficient numbers and to reach German positions from unexpected angles and directions considerably faster and in considerably greater numbers than the beach defense doctrine's core assumptions had projected. This gap between doctrine and battlefield reality would prove to be this documentary's central theme, playing out with particular brutal clarity on one specific beach above all the others assaulted on the 6th of June, 1944. A beach where German defensive preparation had, by every available measure, been executed about as thoroughly and effectively as German coastal defense doctrine could realistically achieve, and where, for several genuinely terrifying hours that morning, it appeared that Rommel's beach defense theory might actually prove entirely correct. It's worth pausing here to note something genuinely important about how this documentary is approaching this specific historical question, because it would be easy in retelling this story to lean toward a simpler, more triumphant framing than the actual historical evidence fully supports. This is not a story about German defensive planning being fundamentally flawed or amateurish in contrast to some inherently superior Allied tactical genius. The specific German defensive theory this documentary has traced in detail was, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely sophisticated and well-engineered response to a real and serious military problem. What this documentary is actually interested in is the considerably more specific and, this channel would argue, considerably more genuinely interesting question of exactly where and why even a well-designed defensive plan can fail against an opponent whose actual battlefield behavior departs from the plan's own core assumptions, a question with implications considerably broader than this one specific battle alone. If a story about the precise, granular gap between brilliant defensive planning and the chaotic reality of actual combat is the kind of history you want more of, take a moment to subscribe. It helps stories like this one find the people who would value them. Now, let's go to that specific beach and to the several hours during which the entire Allied invasion very nearly failed, exactly as German doctrine had predicted it should.
Of the 5 beaches assaulted during the initial D-Day landings, the American sector, codenamed Omaha, presented German defenders with a combination of terrain and defensive preparation that came closer than any other single sector to validating Rommel's entire beach defense doctrine in direct, practical terms. Omaha's specific coastal geography worked considerably in the defenders' favor, independent of any deliberate German fortification effort. The beach itself was overlooked by a range of bluffs, rising steeply from the shoreline to heights that provided German defensive positions with genuinely commanding views across the entire beach and the water immediately beyond it, allowing defenders to observe and engage an approaching invasion force from a considerable distance before troops ever reached the actual sand. This natural terrain advantage, combined with the specific German defensive unit stationed in this sector, the 352nd Infantry Division, a considerably more experienced and combat-capable formation than German intelligence assessments available to Allied planners had indicated would be present in this specific sector, produced a defensive combination that proved, for several hours on the morning of the 6th of June, genuinely close to catastrophic for the American forces attempting to land there. This specific intelligence failure deserves closer examination because it represents a genuinely significant, if somewhat separate, gap in Allied planning that compounded the broader tactical difficulty German beach defense doctrine already posed at this specific location. Allied intelligence assessments in the weeks leading up to the invasion had identified a considerably weaker, less experienced German static defensive division as the primary garrison responsible for the Omaha sector. The 352nd Infantry Division, a more capable and combat-tested formation, had in fact been moved into this specific sector for training and defensive reinforcement purposes only shortly before the actual invasion, a redeployment that Allied intelligence had failed to fully detect and incorporate into pre-invasion planning, meaning that American forces assaulting Omaha Beach that morning faced a considerably more capable and experienced defending force than their own commanders' planning assumptions had prepared them to expect. The specific sequence of events on Omaha Beach that morning has been extensively documented through post-war interviews, official after-action reports, and surviving German defensive records, and it illustrates with particular clarity exactly how close German beach defense doctrine came to achieving its intended tactical objective on this one specific stretch of coastline. Preliminary naval and aerial bombardment intended to neutralize German defensive positions before the actual landing craft arrived proved considerably less effective on Omaha's specific fortifications than planners had hoped, due to a combination of poor visibility, the genuine structural resilience of German reinforced concrete positions specifically engineered to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment, and, in a detailed post-war analysis has specifically identified as significant, a decision to release aerial bombs slightly late to avoid striking landing craft that were, at the time of the bombing run, still approaching the beach. A cautious decision that had the unintended consequence of causing many bombs to fall well inland of their intended targets, leaving German beach defenses largely intact and ready for the landing force that followed. As American landing craft approached the beach, they encountered German defensive fire that began considerably earlier and with considerably greater accuracy and volume than planners had anticipated, given the assumed effectiveness of the preceding bombardment. Machine gun and artillery fire, coordinated through the interlocking enfilade positions described in Act 2, began striking landing craft and disembarking troops while many units were still in deep water, well before reaching anything resembling the shelter of the beach itself. Several documented American units suffered casualty rates during this initial disembarkation phase that later official assessments would describe as among the most severe suffered by any unit during the entire war, with some specific companies losing a substantial majority of their personnel within the first half hour of contact with the beach. Amphibious tanks, specifically designed and modified to swim ashore ahead of the infantry and provide immediate direct fire support against German positions, added a further layer of difficulty to this already severe situation. This specific equipment failure, compounding the earlier bombardment shortfall already described, meant that infantry disembarking on Omaha Beach during these critical opening minutes faced German defensive fire with considerably less immediate supporting firepower of their own than the original invasion plan had called for. For a period of several hours on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the specific tactical situation on Omaha Beach genuinely appeared to observers on both sides to be developing exactly as Rommel's beach defense doctrine had theorized it should. American forces found themselves pinned down on open sand, unable to advance meaningfully inland, taking sustained casualties from German positions on the bluffs above, with follow-on waves of landing craft arriving to find the beach already congested with wrecked vehicles, wounded men, and the considerable physical debris of the ongoing assault, compounding the tactical difficulty for each successive wave attempting to land. Senior American commanders observing the situation from offshore, including General Omar Bradley aboard the command ship USS Augusta, received reports during this specific window of the morning that painted a genuinely alarming picture. Reports suggesting that the Omaha landing might be failing entirely, that American forces might need to be withdrawn from this specific beach if a foothold could not be established within the next several hours. This is not a retrospective dramatic embellishment. It reflects the actual documented uncertainty and concern felt by senior American commanders during this specific period of the battle, based on the fragmentary and genuinely alarming reports reaching them from the beach itself. Bradley's own later post-war accounts of this specific morning describe a genuine, sustained period of uncertainty about whether Omaha represented a serious tactical setback that might require reallocating follow-on forces to the more successful landing sectors, or whether the situation, however alarming the initial reports appeared, might still stabilize given sufficient time. This uncertainty reflected the genuine difficulties senior commanders faced in accurately assessing a rapidly evolving tactical situation from an offshore command position, dependent on fragmentary radio reports from a beach where, as this documentary has already described, the sheer intensity and chaos of the fighting had disrupted much of the normal communication infrastructure that would ordinarily have provided commanders with a clearer, more complete picture of the actual situation developing on the ground. German defenders in this specific sector similarly reported back through their own chain of command during this same period with what were, by the standards of German after-action reporting from this stage of the war, notably confident assessments of the tactical situation. Reports indicating that the American landing at this specific location appeared to be failing, consistent with exactly what Rommel's beach defense doctrine had theorized should happen to any Allied landing force caught in exactly this kind of sustained, coordinated defensive fire while still on open beach. This is the precise moment in the story where this documentary's central question becomes genuinely urgent and interesting. If German beach defense doctrine was, by every reasonable measure available to observers on both sides during these specific hours, apparently succeeding exactly as designed, what actually changed? What specific factor allowed American forces on Omaha Beach to eventually break this deadlock, when the doctrinal logic underpinning German defensive planning suggested that no such breakthrough should have been tactically possible once an attacking force had been pinned down on open beach under this kind of sustained, coordinated fire?
It's worth naming, with as much specificity as the surviving historical record allows, exactly what this small unit initiative actually looked like in practice on Omaha Beach that morning, because the individual granular detail of these actions illustrates this documentary's central argument with considerably more force than the general pattern alone. Colonel George Taylor, commanding the 16th Infantry Regiment, and among the more senior officers who did make it ashore relatively early in the assault, is credited in multiple documented accounts with a specific statement to the men around him during this critical period of the battle, urging them to move off the beach by whatever means necessary rather than remaining in place under continued fire, a statement frequently summarized in the version that has become most widely repeated in subsequent historical accounts as an instruction that only two kinds of men were going to remain on that beach, those who were already dead and those who were about to be. Whatever the precise original wording, the underlying tactical message reflected exactly the kind of on-the-spot leadership initiative developed and delivered under direct fire rather than through any formal pre-battle planning process that ultimately proved decisive in breaking the specific tactical deadlock German defensive doctrine had, by that point in the morning, appeared to have successfully established. Small groups of soldiers,
frequently numbering no more than a dozen men, and led in many documented cases by junior officers or non-commissioned officers who found themselves through the simple chaos of the landing as the senior surviving member of whatever fragment of a unit remained functional and coherent, began independently identifying and exploiting specific gaps in the German defensive line. These groups worked their way through barbed wire obstacles, up drainage gullies and folds in the bluff terrain that offered at least partial cover from direct German observation and fire, and toward specific German positions from angles that those positions, oriented primarily toward the beach and the sea beyond it, had left considerably less well covered by prepared defensive fire. Once these small groups had successfully reached the high ground overlooking the beach, they were able to begin directly engaging German positions from behind or from the flank, a tactical development German defensive doctrine oriented overwhelmingly toward defeating an enemy while still on the beach itself had not adequately prepared individual defensive positions to withstand. German machine gun crews and infantry positioned to fire outward across the beach found themselves increasingly vulnerable to American soldiers now approaching from directions their positions had not been specifically designed or oriented to defend against, a tactical reversal that began gradually and unevenly across different specific points along the Omaha sector to unravel the coordinated defensive fire that had made the beach itself so lethal during the initial hours of the landing. Individual acts of courage during this specific phase of the fighting have become, understandably, a significant part of how Omaha Beach is remembered and commemorated in the decades since, and it's worth being direct about exactly what these acts actually involved in specific tactical terms, rather than treating them purely as abstract heroism disconnected from the concrete tactical problem this documentary has been tracing throughout. A soldier crawling forward alone to place a demolition charge against a section of barbed wire, opening a path for the men behind him. A small group working their way, weapon by weapon, up a specific gully in the bluff face, testing each fold in the terrain for cover from direct German observation. A junior officer, with no clear communication back to any higher headquarters, making the specific tactical judgment that continuing to advance, however dangerous, offered better odds of survival than remaining exposed on open sand under continued fire. These were the actual granular building blocks of the broader tactical collapse this documentary has been describing, repeated independently without central coordination at dozens of separate points along the beach that same morning. This gradual, uneven, small unit erosion of the German defensive position on Omaha Beach proceeded critically without German senior command in this sector fully understanding in real time exactly what was happening across the full length of the defended coastline they were responsible for. German communication and observation capacity during this specific phase of the battle faced its own severe practical limitations, factors that compounded the specific doctrinal gap already described in Act 6. Naval gunfire support, once American warships offshore were able to more precisely identify and engage specific German defensive positions as the morning progressed, began systematically destroying or suppressing individual German strongpoints, disrupting both the physical defensive capability of these positions and, critically, the communication links connecting individual forward positions back to higher German command echelons responsible for coordinating the broader defensive response across the entire sector. The specific role of naval gunfire support during this phase deserves particular emphasis because it represented one of the more genuinely decisive, if less individually dramatic, factors in the battle's eventual outcome. American and British destroyers moving in remarkably close to shore, in several documented instances closer than standard naval doctrine of the period would ordinarily have considered prudent given the risk of grounding or mine damage, began directly engaging individual German positions with considerable precision once forward observers ashore, and in several cases the ship's own crews observing directly, were able to identify specific targets. This close, direct naval fire support proved instrumental in suppressing several of the German positions that had been inflicting the heaviest casualties on the beach during the morning's critical early hours, providing exactly the kind of concentrated, precisely directed firepower that the earlier, less accurate preliminary bombardment described in Act 4 had failed to deliver. This meant that senior German commanders responsible for the Omaha sector specifically were, for a genuinely significant portion of the battle's critical morning hours, working from an increasingly incomplete and outdated picture of the actual tactical situation developing across the beach, continuing to receive and act on earlier reports suggesting the landing was being successfully contained, even as individual American units, unknown to this same senior command structure, were actively working their way up the bluffs and beginning to unravel the defensive position from directions and angles the original defensive plan had not adequately anticipated or prepared for. This specific communication and observation gap illustrates a broader, genuinely important pattern connecting this documentary directly to this channel's earlier coverage of the specific institutional differences between American and German command culture during the Normandy campaign more broadly. German defensive doctrine, for all its genuine tactical sophistication at the level of individual position design and obstacle placement, depended on a considerably more centralized command structure than the American forces attacking it, a structure that, once disrupted by the specific combination of naval bombardment, communication breakdown, and the sheer chaotic intensity of the battle itself, proved considerably less capable of adapting in real time to a tactical situation developing faster and less predictably than the original defensive plan had anticipated, compared to the American forces on the beach, whose junior officers and non-commissioned officers, per the specific decentralized command culture this channel's earlier documentary on American mission command doctrine has already examined in detail, proved considerably more capable of independent, adaptive tactical decision-making precisely when formal command and communication channels had broken down most severely. This is worth situating within the broader institutional pattern this channel has traced across its Normandy-related coverage more generally. German military planning at the strategic and operational level frequently demonstrated genuine sophistication and technical excellence. The Atlantic Wall's engineering, the specific tactical logic of enfilade fire and interlocking defensive positions, the careful tidal and beach gradient calculations underpinning obstacle placement, all reflected a genuinely capable, professionally executed defensive planning process. What this same planning process consistently struggled to fully account for across multiple different specific tactical contexts this channel has now examined in detail was the specific decentralized adaptability of the force it was ultimately fighting against, an adaptability that emerged not from superior individual courage or superior equipment, but from a specific, deliberately cultivated institutional culture that had spent nearly 2 decades, dating back to George Marshall's reforms at Fort Benning in the 1920s, preparing American officers and non-commissioned officers specifically to keep functioning effectively when formal plans and formal communication channels broke down under the genuine chaos of actual combat. By the early afternoon of the 6th of June 1944, the cumulative effect of dozens of these small, individually improvised tactical breakthroughs had fundamentally altered the tactical situation on Omaha Beach, even though no single dramatic, centrally coordinated American assault had occurred to produce this shift. Individual German positions increasingly isolated from mutual support as adjacent positions were suppressed or overrun by American units approaching from unexpected directions began falling one by one in a pattern that, viewed retrospectively, illustrates exactly the specific tactical dynamic this documentary has traced throughout.
A beach defense doctrine designed to defeat a centrally coordinated invasion force was, in practice, defeated by a genuinely decentralized, adaptive series of small unit actions that the doctrine's own core planning assumptions had not adequately anticipated. American engineers, working under continued but increasingly reduced and disorganized German fire as individual defensive positions fell, began systematically clearing paths through the remaining beach obstacles described in Act 2, allowing follow-on waves of landing craft, vehicles and reinforcements to come ashore with considerably reduced risk compared to the earlier waves that had faced the beach's full, intact defensive system. By mid-afternoon, American forces had established a genuine, if still precarious, foothold, extending from the beach itself up onto the bluffs and the terrain immediately beyond, a foothold that would continue to be reinforced and expanded over the following days as the broader Normandy campaign developed. The specific work of these combat engineers deserves its own recognition within this documentary's broader account, because their contribution during this critical afternoon period represented its own genuinely difficult and dangerous tactical achievement, distinct from, though closely connected to, the small unit infantry actions already described in detail. Working with demolition charges under continued sniper and artillery fire, engineer teams systematically destroyed or cleared the remaining German obstacles blocking vehicle access to the beach, a task that required sustained, methodical work directly within range of whatever German positions had not yet been suppressed or overrun, and that proved essential to the broader operational goal of getting tanks, artillery and heavier equipment ashore in the volume the follow-on campaign would require. German after-action reports from this sector, reviewed by historians in the decades since, reveal a genuine and, in retrospect, somewhat poignant confusion about exactly how and why the defensive position had ultimately collapsed, given how genuinely effective it had appeared to be functioning during the critical early morning hours of the battle. Surviving German officers interviewed after the war frequently described a sense that the defensive position had simply, gradually, and almost imperceptibly come apart from multiple directions simultaneously, rather than being defeated through any single, identifiable American breakthrough that senior German command could point to and analyze as the specific, decisive moment the battle had turned. A genuinely accurate reflection, this documentary would suggest, of the actual decentralized, small unit nature of the American tactical response that had in fact produced exactly this kind of gradual, multi-directional, difficult to pinpoint collapse. By evening on the 6th of June, American forces on Omaha Beach had established a foothold extending roughly 1.5 miles inland at its deepest points, considerably short of the more ambitious objectives originally planned for the first day of the invasion, but sufficient to guarantee that the beachhead itself would not be dislodged by any remaining German counterattack capacity in the immediate area. The specific cost of achieving even this more modest first-day objective had been severe. Omaha Beach's casualty figures for the 6th of June alone rank among the most costly single-day totals of the entire European campaign for any comparable American unit, a human cost that later official assessments and popular historical memory alike have consistently treated as emblematic of the entire D-Day landing, even though, as this documentary's earlier comparison in Act 10 will establish, the specific severity of the Omaha experience was not fully representative of conditions across every landing sector that same morning. The following days brought a steady, if still difficult and costly, expansion of the Omaha beachhead, as American reinforcements, equipment and supplies continued flowing ashore through the same beach that had so nearly proven catastrophic on the invasion's first morning. Engineers continued clearing obstacles and establishing the logistical infrastructure, supply routes, vehicle parks, medical stations necessary to support the broader Normandy campaign that would follow, gradually transforming a beach that had briefly seemed likely to become the site of the invasion's single most significant failure into one of the primary logistical gateways through which the entire subsequent liberation of France would be supplied and sustained.
It's worth briefly examining the other Allied landing beaches on the 6th of June 1944, specifically because the comparative experience across these different sectors helps confirm this documentary's central argument about the specific gap between German doctrine and actual battlefield outcome, rather than suggesting that Omaha's particular experience was simply an isolated anomaly. At beaches like Utah in the American sector and the British and Canadian sectors further along the coast, German defensive preparation was, for a combination of reasons including weaker natural terrain advantages, less experienced or more thinly spread defending units, and in Utah's specific case, a landing that came ashore somewhat off its intended location at a point where defenses happened to be considerably less developed, generally less formidable than the specific combination of factors that had made Omaha so exceptionally difficult. Allied casualties at these other beaches, while still serious and in several specific instances significant, were considerably lower than at Omaha, and Allied forces at these locations generally achieved their initial tactical objectives with somewhat greater speed and considerably reduced difficulty compared to the specific ordeal that unfolded on Omaha's stretch of coastline that same morning. Utah Beach's specific experience deserves particular mention precisely because it offers this documentary a genuinely instructive contrast to Omaha's ordeal. Strong currents on the morning of the invasion pushed the first waves of American landing craft roughly a mile south of their intended landing zone, an error that, purely by chance rather than through any deliberate planning, brought troops ashore at a point where German defenses were considerably lighter than at the originally planned landing site. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the senior officer present with the first wave ashore at Utah, and son of the former president, is credited with the specific pragmatic decision to proceed with the invasion from this unplanned location rather than attempting to correct the error and land at the originally intended beach under fire, reportedly remarking that the war would simply start from right where they actually were. A decision that historians have generally credited with contributing directly to Utah Beach's comparatively low casualty figures and rapid establishment of a secure beachhead that first day. The British and Canadian sectors further along the coast, at beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword, encountered their own specific mix of tactical challenges, and, in several cases, their own significant casualties and difficult fighting, particularly around specific strongly defended positions and the challenge of linking up the separate beachheads into a single continuous front in the days immediately following the initial landing. But none of these sectors, taken as a whole, replicated the specific concentrated severity of the Omaha experience during those critical early morning hours, a pattern that reinforces this documentary's broader argument about the specific combination of terrain, defending unit quality, and doctrinal application that made Omaha the single closest approach to Rommel's beach defense theory actually succeeding anywhere along the entire invasion front. This comparative pattern across the different landing sectors reinforces this documentary's central argument in a specific, useful way. Omaha Beach represents, in effect, the specific test case where German beach defense doctrine was applied with its greatest available thoroughness and effectiveness against terrain that specifically favored the defender. And even here, under these most favorable possible conditions for the German defensive theory to succeed, the doctrine ultimately failed. Not because the fortifications themselves were inadequately designed or the obstacle systems insufficiently thorough, but because the doctrine's core assumption about how a pinned-down, disorganized attacking force would actually behave under sustained pressure proved, in this specific and genuinely well-documented instance, simply incorrect. The other beaches, where German defensive preparation was somewhat less thorough and where Allied forces accordingly faced a somewhat less severe test of exactly this same doctrinal gap, still demonstrate the same underlying pattern in a less dramatically compressed form. German coastal defense doctrine across the entire Normandy invasion front consistently underestimated the specific tactical adaptability of small Allied infantry units operating under decentralized command, a pattern that recurs, as this channel's other Normandy-related coverage has already explored, throughout the broader campaign that followed the initial landings themselves. Let's take a step back now and look at the full shape of what this story has actually been about. Because I don't think it's really a story about concrete bunkers or tidal calculations, or even about the specific tactical genius or failure of any one German commander's defensive theory. I think it's a story about the specific, recurring limits of any defensive plan built primarily around predicting how an enemy force will behave, rather than around the messier, harder-to-model reality of how individual human beings actually respond when a carefully designed plan starts to fall apart around them. Rommel's beach defense doctrine was not a foolish or poorly conceived theory. It was, by the specific military planning logic of its time, a genuinely sophisticated, carefully engineered response to the real strategic problem an amphibious invasion posed to a coastal defender. It very nearly worked exactly as designed, on the one specific beach where German preparation and terrain advantage combined most favorably in the defender's favor. What defeated it in the end was not some overwhelming Allied technological advantage or some brilliant centrally coordinated tactical counterplan devised by Allied generals in advance of the landing. It was dozens of small, disconnected, individually courageous decisions made by junior officers and ordinary soldiers, pinned down on open sand, cut off from clear orders, choosing to move forward anyway rather than remain in place under fire. Decisions that German defensive doctrine, however sophisticated its engineering and however thorough its tactical planning, had simply never adequately modeled as a realistic possibility for a force experiencing the specific degree of chaos and disorganization German positions were, in fact, successfully inflicting on the beach that morning. That is the actual specific answer to the question this documentary's title poses. The Germans in Normandy did not fail to understand concrete, or tides, or the mechanics of a coastal fortification. On every one of those specific technical questions, German planning was, by any reasonable measure, genuinely excellent. What they failed to understand, or perhaps simply failed to adequately plan around, was the specific, stubborn unpredictability of the individual human beings they were actually fighting against. Men who, even while being killed and wounded in genuinely appalling numbers on open sand, exactly as German doctrine predicted they should be, kept finding gaps in the plan anyway, and kept moving forward through them. There is a specific, quiet lesson embedded in that fact that extends well beyond this one particular battle, and it's worth stating plainly before this documentary closes. The most sophisticated defensive plan in the world is still, at its core, a prediction about how other people will behave under specific circumstances. And predictions about human behavior under the genuine, chaotic pressure of combat are, this documentary's evidence would suggest, considerably less reliable than predictions about tides, or concrete, or the physics of a landing craft approaching a defended beach. Rommel's engineers could calculate exactly when the tide would expose an attacking force to maximum danger. What none of them could fully calculate was exactly what a frightened, furious, and genuinely determined group of ordinary soldiers would do once that danger actually arrived. If you think the story of Omaha Beach deserves to be remembered not just as a story of overwhelming firepower and sacrifice, but as a genuinely fascinating case study in exactly where military planning succeeds and where it breaks down, take a moment to subscribe. It's genuinely the whole reason this channel exists. And let me know in the comments, what other specific moments from D-Day do you want this channel to cover in this kind of depth?